Hey everybody, how's it going? I got another video today on Factorio. So I released the blueprints, I released some documents, I released some video on how to use my train network. And there's been some response, some people seem to be interested. It doesn't seem to actually be that many people who are interested. Nobody's told me if they're actually using it yet. But I've been using it, it's been working really well. And somebody recommended me check out this subreddit today called Technical Factorio, and it's got all sorts of like circuits and optimized, ways of doing common circuitry functionality, and it's got all sorts of interesting stuff. I also saw this guy put out this um, this circuit generator for calculating pi today. That was amazing. So you can do all sorts of cool stuff with this game circuits, but they are complicated when you have so many of them together and you got to cram them all together. You can easily lose track of what they're doing. I've already started to kind of forget what a lot of my circuits are doing, and most likely I'm going to have to make adjustments to this at some point in the future, and most likely I'm going to have forgotten how a lot of this works. And a lot of people have also expressed some interest in how it works, even if I don't know if they're actually using it. So I'm going to talk about that today. I'm going to get into the technical details of the circuits, how they work together, how they're doing what they're doing. And so let's get into that. I'm going to start simply with a supply station here. The supply station, it only has a handful of parts. It's got basically four things. This one here just defines the load size. It's a constant combinator. That's all we really need is this one signal that I've got as a train car. And then this one here tests if anything is larger than that must be the supply on hand, then it will signal the stop. And this one here says if the stop is on and the train is not here, then send a signal. So it'll send the supply signal onto the line. And right now we are under supply, so it's not signaling yet. And the station itself actually also has some conditions to it. It's got this one here that basically says if the station is on but there's no train, then enable it. Once the train arrives, the station will turn off, or if this signal goes off, the station will turn off. This one sends the train ID as this type of a signal, which this one reads, and also this one reads. So that's pretty basic, just a few pieces. It's a lot simpler than those are the essential pieces it needs. I kind of stripped down the IVTN stops to get to this bare minimum, which I thought was the bare minimum functionality. I also made it where it doesn't divide by, because I don't want to send more than one value. I don't want to send a higher than one value for a single stop, because I only want the stop to be addressed by one train at any point anyway. So I set it to just send one. So let's see. This is a requester station. It's very similar. There's just one real difference in the logic. This is a minimum that it needs to have on hand. So instead of saying is anything greater than, we're saying is everything less than. So it just reverses that. And this circuit's exactly the same, and this is pretty much the same too. So that's how those work. Now let's get into the big deal. This is the component that really sets this system apart from the others, the depot computer, and it's got a lot of things going on in there. Both of these have been tweaked a little bit. Actually, maybe I should. Yeah, screw it. I'm just going to go from these. So there's several pieces in here that work somewhat independently for the most part. Let's see if I can illustrate them clearly. Here is one piece that sort of acts as an independent unit. This is the requester side memory unit, and the pieces that manipulate that memory. This is the actual value itself. Wait, why is it doing that? This is the actual cell itself that keeps track of the unaddressed supply requests. Supply signals. These have not been addressed. No trains have been issued for these here. If they are issued, it will get decremented. So yeah, this is the this main memory memory unit right here. And so these two pieces here, they are both for manipulating this value. So this side here is for decrementing it. So if a train takes off, or another station handles it, or a skip stop goes and skip stops don't work on this part actually. They only work on the demand side. But yeah, basically if a signal's coming from a train in this station or a totally different depot, it'll send a decrement signal that comes up this path here. I'm going to get into it. So what it does, the decrement values come in on the high word of the red line for with the signal that corresponds to the commodity type. Where are my commodities? Okay, here's, so like for example, if I had an iron ore requester decrement signal, it would come from off the network. It would be in the high word with the coal value attached to it. I mean, not coal, iron ore. And so it'll come up over here. This shifts everything down to the low word. So if there was a high word value, it will wind up in the low word, the lower 16 bits of double word. And then it goes up here. This adds, this basically multiplies it by -1. And it also, in the same tick, carries over to here, which does nothing but just pass the number along for that same one tick. So by the second tick, this value that's been multiplied by -1, it goes into this adder also. So we get that value. It's a positive value. A tick later, it gets canceled out, and a tick later, that negative number is the only value left, because the original pulse of the positive value, it gets passed down the line. It gets passed through this adding combinator. It gets passed over here. But since the positive value is less than 0, it gets totally ignored. So that signal gets lost. So the next tick later, though, we have the negative value. The negative value, it comes in here, and it's below 0. So it gets passed along into the memory unit right here. And so that decrements the value from the memory unit. And on this side over here, it's more or less the same chain of logic, but for incrementing. So whenever a new station comes online out there, it's got supply available, it'll add 1 onto the network, and that signal will come in on this red wire. It'll come over here, and it'll wind up in here. What this does is it strips off the top, the high word of the double word. So this value right here is the maximum value you can have in a single word, which is 16 bits. So anything that's above the 16 bits, it gets erased. So any high word values, it does not go into this chain of circuits here. It gets cut off. So this is for these readable signals that I can easily see, 1s, 2s, anything less than 65,000 something. So they'll come in here, and it's the same chain of logic. It tries to multiply by -1, but there's a 1 tick delay on that. So then the positive value comes in here, and the next tick, the negative comes along, the positive comes out, and this next one here tests for positive values only. So whenever the signal goes up, it'll get caught by this combinator, and it'll go into the memory unit. But whenever it goes down, it doesn't get caught. It will ignore down signals on the low word. It'll totally ignore those, because they're going to go down. They're going to go up and down, but we only want to know when a new station is needing to be addressed. They're generally going to go down because we've already sent a train. We've already decremented the value because we've already sent the train. Then the train arrives at the station sometime later. At that point, we've already handled it. So we don't want to decrement it again. We've already done it. We've already handled it. So that's how this value is incremented and decremented. And right next to it, this one here, it just only gets 1 for each signal. So like say I've got supply of 3 of these red circuits and 2 of those sciences or whatever. When it comes out this side, everything's stripped down to one, because I'm only going to try and handle, one at a time, one train for one signal at one time. So that these are all the signals I actually want to address at any time. And that gets combined with a count over here. I'll get into that later. And it also gets combined with the color. I'll get into that later too. And so down here we have all the same circuits that do the exact same thing as I just went through with supply, but these are the demand side. These are the ones that whenever a new station comes online, that's demanding a certain resource, requesting a certain resource. So they're the exact same. I got a decrement side, I got a supply side, an increment side. I got a memory unit, and I've got the one that cuts it down to 1. So these specific combinators on this side and on this side, they do the same thing, but this one's for supply, this one's for demand. Okay. Alright, so I can also cover these right here. There's these 3 combinators right here. Ignore the constant combinator for now. These guys right here, what they do is they handle signals coming from the trains. So whenever one of these trains takes off, it's got a signal that needs to respond to. It'll send a signal, it winds up on this red line, and it comes over to here, and then it comes down to here. And the reason why I'll talk about that in a second. But what it does is these are basically for decrement signals. I want to send a decrement signal to either the supply or demand side. And so in order to do that, each of these signals that's coming from the train, they'll be paired up with a color. Green for demand and red for supply. And whenever they respond to a signal, it'll send their signal with either the red color or the green color on the red line down to this decrement router. I'm going to call it a decrement router. And so here's how it works. It comes over here, comes in this side, and it shifts this up to the high word, because remember the high word of these 2 lines, red and green lines, is for basically decrementing the memory module, the memory units on these 2 modules. So it comes in here. This shifts it up to the high word. Shifts up, like this could be a value of 1. It should always just be a value of 1. It should never be higher, actually. Anyway, it shifts it up to the high word. Then I've got a test in here. If there's a green signal of any kind, then it's for demand, and it'll send it over this green wire. And if there's a red signal, that's a supply signal, and it'll send it over the red line. And it just sends it as is. We don't want to adjust these values at all. They're high word shifted, so they'll be something like 65,000 plus. And they go out onto the network, and then they come right back in. See, the red ones will come right back in over here. The green ones, they'll go back into the system right here. They share a line out to the big pole. But it also goes onto the whole network, though. So if you have a second depot, then the other depot will also get these signals. The decrement signals that get sent from this one will get processed on every depot, and every decrementer's signals will get processed on every depot. Anyway, so that's how they stay in sync. That's why I send the signals for decrementing all the way to the main line, all the way to the network, and do all the high word shifting and all that stuff, instead of just bypassing it and jumping right into this area here somewhere. You don't want to do that, because then the computers will get out of sync. You want all the computers to stay in sync, so they send all their decrement signals onto the main network. Okay, so that covers the demand, the supply, the memories, and the decrementer. There's still a couple more pieces to cover that are pretty important. So one of the things that this train network does that is unique is that it can, trains will come back to the station when they're either unloaded or loaded, whether they're waiting for supply or demand. And I always need to be able to know when a train leaves and why it's left for any reason. I tried a whole lot of different ways of managing these trains. I tried to have two stations at one point that were right next to each other. One that was for demand trains, one was for supply trains. But that turned out to be unnecessary. I tried to do two different ways of detecting when trains were there, why they were there, and that also turned out to be unnecessary. I came up with a bunch of different ways of trying to manage it. Many of them didn't work. Many of them didn't work compatibly. Many of them didn't work with the same station, and many of them needed a lot more combinators. So what I finally came up with that worked really simple, it only needed one set of combinators for both signals, was that it sends an independent one tick pulse of a signal for each supply or demand signal along with a commodity, one tick at a time. So for any combination of these commodities I have on hand, for supply or demand, it'll send a one tick pulse to each train in sequence, and they'll have time to respond or not, and there'll also be a blank tick in between. Like this video is recording at 30 frames per second, so you won't probably actually be able to see this, but there's flickering between red and green. Actually, let me slow it down. I don't remember how to do it. Oh, here it is. Okay, so now I've slowed it down, so you can see these signals coming. The ones that are on the green line are coming into the trains. So you can see it flicker red, you know. There's some red signals, there's some green signals. Okay. Now, yeah, so that's how I can send a clean signal to each train, and I have to have a tick in between where it's been blanked out again. And the reason for that is the way I detect a train leaving. I guess I'll get into that now, actually. Let me set down a different blueprint, though, because that one's kind of hard to read. It's pinned in between those. And put down a wide depot. This is the same circuits, the same combinators as that I'm using over here in the thin depot layout, but they're easy to read. I was crammed in. So what happens is the signal comes in from this green wire here, and it goes to the station. It goes in these two combinators. And remember, these come in one tick at a time. It's on, it's off, it's on, it's off. It's always a clean on and off. There's a break in between the signal. Every color, every commodity. So these two right here, what they do is it's similar to these two pieces right here, where there's a multiplier and an adding in it. So it comes into both of these at the same time. This one just passes it along as is, one tick later. This one here, it adds a -1. I mean, it multiplies it by -1, so it makes it negative. It goes into here one tick later, and now the train itself has also received this signal, the same tick as both of these have received the signal. And the train itself will take one tick to respond, if it's going to respond. And so if the train takes off on the very next tick, the train signal itself will disappear all of a sudden. So it'll become negative. And it'll disappear on the same tick that the signal itself turns off, basically. So the signals come in, the train takes off. By the time this -1 is going up into here, the train itself is not coming out anymore either. And it's been going into these two the whole time. So it's already been in here, and it's generally canceling itself out, basically. So that's these two circuits right here. They're going to be hard to see. But the signal itself from the train station, that's for the train, it'll go into both of these, and after one tick, since it's constant, it'll cancel out. There'll be a positive value and a negative value for it coming in over this line at the same time. But once the train leaves, as the signal also dies, I'll have a negative train signal and a negative commodity signal and a negative color signal coming off of this combinator all at once, together, all three together. So that comes over to here, and this one here checks if they're negative, if they're a negative value, because I only want to address negative values on at this point, because I basically want to know when the train leaves. I don't want to know really about much else. So if the train does leave, this one here will get triggered because I'm sending any negative value, I'm swapping it to positive 1. So it'll go over here. The train signal will be 1 if the train has left. And if that's the case, then it will send every value that I have at that time as positive 1 out on the red wire. That'll go onto the pole, and that's this red wire signal that comes over here and goes to the decrementer. And we already know how that part works. I already talked about that. So that cancellation signal, it'd go all the way back to one of these 2 memory units. But if it's not 1, that means either there is no train or the train didn't leave. There's no train signal. So I don't care about. Basically, that means the train didn't do shit with it, or it's not there. So it'll pass all of the signals that we have as let's see. At this point, they've been turned into positive 1s, and this sends them as is, which is going to be positive 1s for the commodities and the supply or demand signals, and that'll send those as a green signal onto this pole. And the way these are chained, the green doesn't just go pole to pole. It instead goes from pole to station, back into these, and then back to the pole, then to the next station, and back onto these. So we're not shortcutting the green wire. It has to go through each one of these sets. So as you can see, sorta, there's a rippling effect. They'll kind of ripple down the line. Each train can address the signal or not, and if it doesn't, it just keeps rippling down the line. And each new train gets these signals as positive values again, just like from the originator over here. So they each get a chance to leave, and if they do leave, I record it, and it doesn't send a second train to do the same thing. And that's how that works. And I can, based on their pairing with the color, I can identify whether it's the supply or demand, and based on the commodity type, I can tell which commodity it's for. So I have all the important information coming all the way back into the network, back into the smart computer off the network. So how do I get those signals out to the trains, though? That's the only piece left I haven't really talked about. Right? I pretty much talked about how the trains address the signal, talked about how the memory figures out what kind of signals I want to send, and I've talked about how to cancel values out of the memory, basically. But I haven't actually talked about how this very carefully crafted signal gets out to the trains themselves. So that's done with a combination of this one here, which basically, we talked about, it basically sets the supply commodities. We got a constant signal of 1 for each one, but we can't send constant signals to the train because that will cause all sorts of problems. I tried that. What I want to do is I want to send a 1-tick pulse of that signal along with the color. So that's where this counter comes in. And I've kind of got some of these counter components kind of spread across this whole computer. So this is the main counter right here. I'm using the value C. I'm basically cycling through every 80 ticks with this one. So I could also change this. Remember, there's 60 ticks a second, so that's a little more than a second to iterate through all of them. You can change this. I could change this to 120. You basically want to make sure this value is always higher than the total number of commodity signals that you're going to be sending. And you can't send a commodity signal every tick because you need to clean on and off for both supply and demand. You can overlap them, sorta. I mean, you can overlap ons with offs and offs with ons, but you can't overlap ons on both at the same time. You don't want any of these testers to be seeing negative values or positive values at the same time for 2 different kind of signals. That would be cross signals. So when the train leaves, it'll decrement 2 different memory values and 2 different combinators for one train. That'll cause you an error. So you want to have clean signals. So I'm going to get into how I separate all that. So here's the counter. This is a very important piece of it. And then it goes over here The signal comes into here. This tests if it tests each other signal basically coming into this and sees if it's matching the count. And the other signals that are coming into this, they're coming from down here. These constant combinators. These define all the commodities. It also starts the counter. This value of 1, it just keeps getting fed back in every tick by this wire that goes from both the input and output of the counter. It just keeps feeding this the value that was already in here before, and then it comes back over to this side, which magically adds the value of 1 from the wire coming in, adds another 1. So even though there's not any addition in the counter itself, every tick it re-adds this 1, keeps counting. And the rest of these values, they are for sending. We want to send these values, but we only want to send 1 at a time. And that's why each one of these commodities has a unique number value on it. And they're also even because I don't want to send, I need a gap in between a clean on and off for supplies and demand. I'll get into that in a second. So, back over to here, you can see the output signal is flickering. Let me slow it down again. So you can see it cycling through all the different commodities. It sends a 1 tick pulse for each one of these commodities, 1 at a time. Okay, so that comes out here, comes into here. If we have a value in here that's greater than 1, then send 1. Because see, these values, they actually have a unique value that's greater than 1. I don't want to send 18 for copper every time. I want to send 1 for copper. So this next one basically just takes out all those iterator values, those indexes. It takes those out. We just send 1. So you can actually see the output. It's firing off 1. And the count itself will... wait, what's going on? Am I on the right one? Put the specified signal. Why is it not already 1? That's confusing me. See, I'm already starting to forget how some of this works, so let me refresh my memory here for a second. Why do I have both of these? Oh, okay, I see what's going on. This is greater than 1. It's not greater than or equal to 1, it's greater than 1. So what this does is it combines the output of this value right here, this one here that's pulsing. It's already down to 1, regardless of what the index was. And then it combines it with this, which is also maximum of 1 for just the commodities we want to actually send signals for. So if we don't actually have any of these commodities, it won't send these signals. We have to be on the right tick, and we actually have to have a supply available of those commodities. And then it goes into here. It sees if it's greater than 1, which would be 2, and then it sends that 1 thing. So you can see every now and then there'll be 1 tick of some of these commodities coming through with the value of 1. So now we have 1 tick of the commodity that we want to send to the trains, but we don't have any way of knowing whether it's a supply or demand. So there's one more piece to do that, and well, there's 2 pieces. This is a constant combinator I have right here, which has a value of -1 with the color that I want to send with all my supply signals. And this one right here, I gotta refresh my memory on how this part works. Anything greater than 0. Okay, so that's this signal. That's the signal coming from this guy right here. For any of these that actually come out true, it'll send a value of like steel, 1. That'll come over to here, where the input is a -1 value and possibly a +1 value. And so if any of them are greater than 0, it'll send all of them as +0. So that'll flip this sign to a positive, and it'll output it onto the line. So that's how I combine the color with the signal only when there's a signal. Otherwise the red is off. The red is always off coming onto this pole, except for when there's a commodity that it's signaling along with. So that's that. That's how it does it on the supply side. And The problem is if we send signals for both supply and demand, like say we want to do a supply run and a request run for iron ore. We don't want to send these signals at the same time. And we actually don't want to ever send any supply signal along with any demand signal at the same time. So what I did for that is I used this same counter value, which is coming down from over here, and it's coming over to this guy right here. This is the same kind of function that this one right here does, except for this one has an extra combinator coming into it. This green wire comes from this constant combinator, and it has a -3 decrementer. I mean a -3, it gets added in. So this will always offset the counter value to be 3 behind the supply side value. So otherwise it'll iterate through all the same commodities, it'll send all the same type of signals out to the trains, except for it'll do it 3 ticks behind. So this way I can have a clean signal overlapping between the supply and demand, but only one of them will be going positive or negative at the same time. And so as long as they're not both positive or both negative at the same time, it'll be fine. I can overlap them in the other direction. And that's why -3. Don't make it a negative even number, and that'll break it. I tried that. I also tried not having I also tried like having an index of every value instead of just odds. That also caused problems. A lot of trial and error to get here. And on this side, it's once it gets the signal, it does a similar thing where it adds the negative value of the color, which I jammed in down here, which is kind of off out of the way, but I was trying to cram it within a certain footprint. But yeah, that's how that does. That's how it adds the green, puts it onto the same pole, goes out over the same green wire, goes out to all the trains. One tick, one pulse, one commodity, one supply or demand value at a time out to all the trains. And that's pretty much all the pieces, how all of them work. It took a lot of experimentation and trial and error. A lot of this I had to come up with on my own. There's apparently resources that probably would have helped a whole lot on technical Factorio, but I didn't realize that until recently. So one of the features I did just learn, which is awesome, which would have come in so much handy, is this fucking editor. Look at this. This function right here would have saved me hours of trouble. You pause the game, you can tick one pulse at a time, and you can check the status in between. That would have been so valuable. I just didn't know this existed. I tried to look up mods to do it. I could not find anything to do it. That would have been so handy, because I was getting cross signals out here and could not figure it out. So what I was having to do, since I didn't know about that, is I was setting the game speed really low, like 0.5, and then recording a video and trying to mouse over them so I could watch their state, but it was still too fast for the eye to really follow. So then I had to go and watch the video that I just saved to try and, carefully record signal changes and check one tick later what came out. Totally time-consuming and difficult way to do it. I wish I'd known about that editor. So awesome. This is the editor. Type /editor. You go to the time here, and it pauses the game. You can step one tick at a time. So useful. Really cool. Like, you can watch these signals ripple down. So cool. Anyway, that is all I got today. I hope somebody enjoyed this. If not, it'll at least come in handy for me later if I ever have to go make changes, so I can refresh my memory and figure out what the hell this crazy block of combinators is doing. So anyway, have a good one. I'll see you around. Later.